Hello, it's Clinton Power here from the Mind Body Training Institute, and I'm very excited to be back here in our free training on narcissism with Wendy Behary. Hello, Wendy. Great to see you again.
Hey, Clinton. Good to be with you too.
Now, in the first video, we were talking about really defining narcissism. What is it, and how do we know if someone has narcissism, and where might they be on that spectrum?
Yeah.
But in this video, I want to talk to you about and really ask you, can narcissists change? We touched in the first video about how lots of therapists kind of even avoid working with narcissists. There is this kind of belief that they're often untreatable, they don't come to therapy, and if they do, they don't stay long. So let's really get to the truth of some of these beliefs and maybe bust some of these myths as well.
Yeah.
Do you believe narcissists can change?
I do. I mean, it's hard, and I don't think that one should. I mean, we have to manage our expectations when we're treating narcissists because there's a lot of obstacles in place, there's a lot at stake for partners and family members. But the big question, what this boils down to, I mean, I've seen some narcissists make some really meaningful changes in their lives. I've sat and worked with mostly narcissistic men. I have treated some women too, but mostly narcissistic men. And I've worked with some of the most challenging and severe cases. And I've watched them open up to their vulnerability and begin to do the work that, we'll talk about at some point, that can bring them to that place of awareness and recognition, consciousness about what's happening behind the scenes and how they constructed these various masks that they wear. And it's very satisfying and touching in ways and meaningful to families, meaningful to them in terms of future. So yes, they can change. I would say this, they can change in some of the ways that can be very meaningful. Do they change completely? No, probably not. I mean, I don't think anyone changes completely, but that's my bias. I think that no one changes completely. We have memory, and our memory is so sensitive to conditions out there in the universe that activate it, which can have us sometimes flip into different coping modes or reactive modes. So I don't think they change completely. I do think they are highly sensitive humans. It's just a guess because we can't prove temperament necessarily, but I think they are highly sensitive humans who, come into the world with this nature and meet an environment that doesn't necessarily meet their needs, not only in terms of the ways that every child needs, but maybe with some hypersensitivity, some extra needs. So, their suspiciousness about people in the world and what they're up to and that they're going to be cheated or taken advantage of, their levels of entitlement, I don't think it goes away completely, but perhaps enough that we can really lower the intensity and enable them of being able to connect in an intimate way with others. So I do see it as possible, and the big but is if you have leverage.
You mentioned obstacles, Wendy. Let's touch on that. What do you see are some of the biggest obstacles for change when it comes to narcissism?
Two of the toughest ones are this thing I keep repeating about leverage and consequences. What that means is a meaningful consequence, something that matters enough to the narcissist that they don't want to experience it. They don't want to lose their marriage. They don't want to lose contact with their adult children or their children. They don't want to lose their job. They don't want to lose their driver's license. They don't want to deal with the consequence that they're up against. If you have leverage of some form, something that matters enough to them, as a consequence, then chances are you can get them at least into the treatment room. Then the question becomes, how long can you maintain that leverage? Is it long enough to be able to create a sturdy bond between the therapist and the narcissist in the treatment room? And then you need a therapist who is pretty sturdy. Not sturdy where you're a tough guy, but where you're sturdy enough to be able to be the advocate, to be the one who can help them to dive in deep, to be able to look at the scary places that they don't want to go, to be able to own the insecurities that they have masked for a long time, for a lifetime perhaps, to help them to deconstruct their narrative and really understand how they got to be who they are, for better and for worse. Certainly many of them are successful and very competent and very capable. And they worry about losing their edge. And the truth is they don't lose their edge when they're highly competent people. They gain a whole world of, new emotional, intimate connections. But if you don't have that leverage and you don't have that sturdiness in yourself, which is what I spend a lot of time doing, is training therapists how to ready themselves, if they want to, for working with this population. They're difficult because they don't believe they have problems. It's always somebody else's fault. So they externalize the blame. It's the morons they're working with in the office place, or it's their crazy spouse who, just really needs the help more than they do, or it's their ungrateful children who don't appreciate anything. So it's always someone else's fault. And this therapy is a bunch of nonsense, this fluffy, silly, goofy, emotional thing that doesn't pay the bills and doesn't generate wealth and doesn't do anything for my intelligence. So you have to get past, all these obstacles, disparaging criticisms, avoidance, externalizing blame. I don't want to talk about my emotions. I don't feel anything. I don't remember anything. My family was perfect. This is what you're dealing with. Can't wait, right?
Well, I'm thinking, as a couples therapist myself, Wendy, so many times over the years, when we're talking about leverage, I've had a partner bring in their narcissistic partner, and of course the marriage or the relationship is on the rocks. And the partner is often saying, this is the last straw, I'm ready to walk out the door. And it is often that leverage that brings the narcissist into treatment, as you say. So I think that's a really important point. Yeah. I'm guessing not many narcissists wake up and think, gee, I'd like to start some therapy to work on my issues this week.
It's very rare. It's not totally out of the question. I mean, there will be times when if they're dealing with a health issue, a health crisis. Remember, anything that's going to threaten their ability to perform. So whether it's a sexual performance issue, if it's a work performance issue, if it's just that they are being thrown by an illness that makes them vulnerable, where they need to trust people and count on people and connect with people, this can rally them towards therapy because they're anxious, they're depressed, they're worried, they're panicked, but they don't really want therapy. They just want a fix for this thing that has, overthrown their system. Usually they'll go look for medication, most of all, to make it go away. But if they do end up in the treatment room in this kind of desperate panic, they just want to fix. They don't want to be, making links, looking back, dealing with their whole life story. They just want it fixed. So of course it doesn't work because it's not enough.
Yes. And the other point I want to highlight, I think it's an important point, you were referring to the therapist's ability, I guess the way I heard it was to regulate themselves. This must be a big challenge of the therapist, really staying well regulated and grounded and even in the face of incredible blame and criticism or outbursts from narcissists in therapy.
It's a very hard thing to do, and I've been treating them for over 25 years. And I myself will still find there are times when I'm just, I'm thrown, I'm taken aback, and I know that I'm triggered. And here's the thing about narcissism that I think is different in terms of treatment than perhaps other treatment issues. Although in schematherapy, we would say this is probably true for all of our clients, but the need to be real, the need to show up as a real person, as a transparent, real person. It sounds almost silly and ironic and counterintuitive. Like, why would I make myself so vulnerable to someone who is so unempathic and can be so critical? And yet, when we look at their profile, when we look at some of the things that the unmet needs, like the need to feel safe and to feel trust, to feel that someone is really acting on their behalf and not just using them for their performance. When I can say to a narcissistic client, wait a minute, I'm triggered by what you just said. Give me a minute. I'm triggered. And I can expose my own moment of truth to them. And I take a breath and I take a pause, and they're rolling their eyes and they're not, loving this moment right now of honesty, but they're also curious to know what's going on. And I come back to say something like, well, when I get triggered, and I can imagine this is what's happening in your world outside with people who are not trained to understand your makeup. I do understand your makeup, but I'm human. So just now I got triggered when you spoke to me in that critical tone, and I was about to just give in. or I was about to just apologize, or I was about to just get into a, wrestling match with you over this, and that wouldn't have been helpful. So I just needed to kind of find my balance again for a minute, Joe, let's say, and, get back to the work of understanding what's going on. Why would you talk to me like that? So I just took that pause in order to take care of me right in front of my client. And when
Lovely.
we can do that, we really have a chance to not only galvanize ourselves, but really galvanize the relationship. And they are, they may get defensive and they may roll their eyes, but they are intrigued by the openness. So now you've secured a little more trust in the relationship. Because that was just me being real, not using all kinds of fancy psychological language or intellectual language.
I love that example, Wendy, and beautiful kind of interpersonal modeling as well to the client. For those that are watching, there may be people who are in a relationship with a narcissist or perhaps a therapist who has experience or perhaps not experience with working with narcissists. What do you say to those people who say, look, they can't change, I don't believe they can change. They're really feeling despondent about that possibility. And also, how long does change take if it is possible?
I'd say you might be right. You might be right, because more of them don't change, won't change. I don't use the word can't, because I think that we are malleable as humans. We know there's plasticity. Our brains can shift, can grow, can continue to evolve and develop. So I don't say can't, but I say they won't. They won't do the work that it takes necessarily. It's not likely to happen with your narcissistic partner if I've done an assessment to make that determination. But even if I haven't, I might say you might be right. It might not happen. And then you need to ask yourself the next question, which is, how do you emancipate yourself from not only the sense of responsibility that a lot of partners feel, or the regret, or the grief for hanging in for so long, and why didn't I see it? But how are you going to emancipate yourself from the harsh criticalness and self-doubt that you've placed upon yourself for this, when it's not your fault? Not that you're perfect, but it's not your fault. And you may not be right. There may be opportunities or opportunities for change, but it's going to require professional assistance. I don't believe someone with narcissism can change on their own unless they're really of a very mild form.
And Wendy, I'm guessing the work is probably medium to long term. Is that right? This is not short-term solution-focused therapy we're talking about here.
No. If someone has a short-term treatment model for working with narcissists, then they're sitting on a lot of money, because I don't think we have short-term models for these very challenging and complex, because they're complicated personality disorders like narcissism.
So Wendy, can you give us a short case study of someone you've worked with over the years who perhaps you really saw made progress and was able to change some of these narcissistic traits?
Yeah, there's several that come to mind that I have, who were some of my most difficult cases, actually, from the start, where I would almost feel dread knowing they were coming back into session, and yet I was still curious, because I'm very curious, and challenged by the mission, as long as they were willing to come in. So in the case, we'll just call him Joe, because that's just my name I use very often as an example. But in this case of this Joe, there was a lot of leverage. I had leverage because he was at risk for losing not only his high-profile position in his job, but he was also at risk for losing his marriage. So they kind of came together in a time where his wife had just had it with his behaviors. He was very high on the spectrum in terms of intensity and multiple traits of narcissism. And he was, people in his workplace had also had it, with his arrogance and his lack of respect for subordinates, as well as his peers and his superiors. So he was being placed on probation. he was being threatened in a very real way to lose his marriage. So I had very high leverage for him, at least coming in the door. Once he got into therapy, it was not easy. And this was probably a course of 1 to 2, probably almost 2 years of treatment to make a meaningful difference in his life. But what was striking about the leverage with him was that he was able, with my help, because we went through all the rounds of, this is ridiculous and I don't know how this is going to help, and all the blaming of the people at work. They're idiots, they're morons, they don't know what they're doing, and they should really be the ones that are getting help. And then all of the comments and the put downs and the criticisms of his wife and his marriage. So I listened to that for a little while in the beginning, but I would also be watching very carefully for patterns, patterns where he would do the same things to me that I suspected he was doing to people in the workplace and to his wife and maybe even his children at that time to some degree. And I would call him out on these patterns as I observed them. But again, with a lot of preemptive statements, because you have to use a lot of preemptive statements when you're working with narcissists, meaning that they are super sensitive. Everything feels like a criticism. You open your mouth, they feel criticized. You can say it in the gentlest, most eloquent way. They feel criticized. They feel you're up to something. They feel you want something. And, with Joe, the preemptive measures were very helpful and very important. So in other words, the more you understand narcissism, this is the key for any therapist or even any human who's dealing with one out there, who's thinking, what do I care? I don't want to have to understand the complexities of narcissism. It's, I'm not going to work with them, or I'm not going to live with them. I'm not going to deal with it. It's not my fault. It's not my problem. And I say, understand as much as you can, because it then liberates you. It frees you up to remember that the problem is over there. It's not in here. And it allows you to stay a little steadier on your feet when you're working with them. So understand, I understood Joe. I got that his whole life, his whole worth, his whole value was determined by his success in his workplace. I got that that was the thing that really made him feel like he was a standout, extraordinary human. And he was really good at what he did, but he was really poor in the world of interpersonal connection, both with others outside and with his wife. This isn't always true of all narcissists. Some of them are as charming and wonderful as can be outside of their personal life. So understanding him enabled me to use preemptive measures like, this isn't a criticism of you. I know this might sound like I'm putting you down, or I'm trying to one-up you, or I'm just giving you that kind of crazy therapy jargon because I know you're thinking that. So I'm already in his brain empathizing, right? Empathizing, not sympathizing, empathizing, understanding what it is that he's thinking and feeling, so I can eliminate that distraction and not get into the tangled dance of who's right, who's wrong, who's stupid, this doesn't make sense. So lots of preemptive statements like, this isn't meant to be critical of you. This isn't meant to put you down. I'm trying to help you here because I do care about, your family and you and your job and your future. You're a bright man. You've done so well, and you have a lot to feel proud of. When it comes to your interpersonal style, your personal relationships, it's not your strength. Something's stuck there. And it's not that I don't believe that you have any feelings. I believe you probably have some very deep feelings, some very important feelings underneath. But you learned somewhere along the way that they just don't matter. You learned how to do the cover-up. So that's just a glimpse into how, the way the therapy progresses to gain some trust, to get to know them, to try to keep the distractive, defensive, counterattacking behaviors out of the way. And he wasn't easy, so it wasn't like a quick fix or magic. It took a lot of repetitions of this level of empathic confrontation, limit setting, him making demands, me having to refuse his demands and set limits instead, like extra time or, reducing my fee if he came late, something like that. And it's incredibly important because in our model, our approach, we're paying a lot of attention to the needs. And what Joe needed most of all, what he needed most of all was to find out that A, he didn't have to continue to spend his life proving himself to everyone. Like, he had to learn that he was fine as he was. And he was really outstanding in what he did for a living, but he was fine as he was as a human. He also had to learn that there were limits because no one taught him that. He grew up learning that as long as he performed well, he could do whatever he wanted. He could stay up as late as he wanted. He could bend the rules. The world was his as long as he performed well when he was called upon. And so there was a lot of unlearning and relearning and, cultivating a connection between us. And there's a whole lot more I could say about the treatment, but I know we'll get to that at another time. But over time, the softening of the edges, his ability to be able to even see me at times, like if I had a sniffle or a little cough, and to be able to acknowledge that maybe I wasn't feeling well, and not in that charming, heroic, narcissistic way, but as just a real considerate human. So there were striking changes, and I've had a lot of cases like this where I watch the softening occur as the relationship begins to, to bond.
And Wendy, to conclude, where was Joe at the end of treatment in terms of his marriage and his job?
And at the end of the treatment, he was actually in a new job. So he decided that probably it was going to be very hard to reconstruct the bridges with the people at work. There'd been a lot of damage done, and he had lots of opportunities to take his skills elsewhere. And he really wanted to kind of formulate, not to have to like redo his personality, although he did do some remorse work with the people at work that he had hurt. So he spent some time really being able to not just say, I'm sorry, okay, I'm the bad guy, but to be able to really use some empathy and appreciate the experience that they were having by way of his treatment of them, particularly his subordinates. His marriage, I worked for a long time with him individually, and then I brought his wife into the session in the beginning just to really get her story and get a sense of her, get a sense of where she was at. Did she have both feet already out the door, one foot out the door? Where was she? Because that helps as a therapist to know what I'm dealing with. And she was actually quite lovely and pretty worn out, but she wanted to stay the course. And so intermittently I would bring her in, and eventually I saw them together as a couple, and we did some reparation on the marriage. And, he stays in touch with me. So I know to date he's still at least happily married. I'm not so sure about work and how that's really all going, but I'm hopeful that, that's continuing to be in a good place for him.
That's a wonderful case study, Wendy, very inspiring. And thank you so much for sharing all this valuable information. We're going to be back soon in video 3, and I'm really looking forward to this final video in our free training, because we're actually going to be diving into how to deal with a narcissist, whether you live with a narcissist or whether perhaps you're a therapist and you work with narcissists. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you soon about that. Bye for now.
Bye for now. Thanks.
Please